Hi everyone. Today we'll be doing an introduction to chemistry for the biology classes. So first we need to talk about atoms versus elements. Since we're talking about chemistry, we'll start with what matter is. You've likely heard of matter. Matter is basically anything that has mass and takes up space. So almost everything that is physical is matter. It is made up of tiny particles, which are called atoms and molecules. An atom is the smallest particle of matter that can exist that keeps its individual properties. Basically, if you break an atom of, for example, copper up into smaller particles, they are no longer copper. They do not have the properties of copper. So an atom is the smallest particle that still contains or still has the properties of that element. One thing to note, atoms are constantly moving, and this movement helps them interact with other atoms, which later we'll talk about. So I've used the term elements. An element is a substance made up of only one type of atom. So there's a few examples listed here: copper, carbon, helium. You likely know many others: hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. The whole periodic table is filled with all the elements that we know of, and a lot that we have synthesized in labs that do not exist in nature. So atoms, even though they are small, they still have smaller parts to them. And they are made up of some basic particles called protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are found in the central dense area called the nucleus. Right, now this atom is not drawn to scale because they basically never are. Electrons do not orbit this closely, and atoms are mostly made of empty space. However, for our purposes, we'll look at this picture. Electrons, conversely, are found outside the nucleus, and they go around the nucleus. They don't actually go in these nice elliptical or spherical orbits. However, they do go around the nucleus. Alright, the next part is to talk about the charges of these particles. So protons, here in red, have a positive charge. So one proton, one positive charge. Electrons have a negative charge. So one electron, one negative charge. Neutrons, as their name implies, are neutral. They have no charge. So if you look at this atom as a whole, you see two positive charges, two neutral charges, and two negative charges. That means as a whole, this atom has zero charge. Two positives minus two negatives. Alright, the periodic table, hopefully you have seen it. You may not be super familiar, but this is what one entry on the table looks like. So there's a lot of information here. Up here we have a number which is called the atomic number. Here the symbol of the element. Here is the atomic mass, and here is the name of the element. Now what these numbers mean. The atomic number represents the number of protons in the element's or atom's nucleus. So lithium has 3 protons, meaning it's one of the first elements in the table. Generally, when we're talking about neutral atoms, the number of protons equals the number of electrons. So, because there are 3 protons in this lithium atom, I could also say there are 3 electrons. Now, what the atomic mass down here represents, this 7, the way we calculate the mass of an atom is adding up the protons and neutrons. They are much, much bigger than the electrons, so they contribute almost the entire mass of the atom. So the way we calculate the atomic mass is we add protons and neutrons together. So the periodic table will not generally say how many neutrons are in an atom, however you can calculate it. And so to calculate it, we just do the atomic mass minus the atomic number. So 7 minus 3 equals 4, so lithium would have 4 neutrons in its nucleus. Alright, so a little practice here for you to test yourself on. I will pause briefly after each question so you can think about your answer. However, if you want to take more time, simply pause the video, answer, and then start again. So first question here, here's a atom of carbon, its entry from the table shown, and the question is, how many protons does carbon have? So take a second, answer that to yourself. Alright, you should have come up with the number 6, because this is the atomic number and that is the number of protons. Second question, how many electrons does carbon have? Again, you should have come up with the number 6 because protons and electrons are the same in a neutral atom. And last, how many neutrons does carbon have? Again, one more time, you should have come up with 6. Now you may be wondering, why do I have 12.011 here? How could you have 0.011 of a proton or a neutron? And the answer is that you can't have a fraction of a proton or neutron. But what this number on the table really represents is the average mass of all the carbon that there is in the universe. And there's some carbon that is heavier than other carbon. So for example, a lot of carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. That gives it a mass of 12. But there's some carbon that has 8 neutrons. So 6 protons, 8 neutrons gives it a mass of 14. So if we take all the carbon with a mass of 12 and all the carbon with a mass of 14 and we average them, and there's a lot more of 12, we get a mass of 12.011. So normally when you're calculating this, you round that number and then subtract to get the number of neutrons. Alright, if you need to draw atoms or understand a picture of an atom, the most common model for the drawings is called the Bohr diagram. It depicts the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus with the number written next to them. This is an example, so it doesn't have numbers, but you could fill that in if you knew what atom we were doing. And then the electrons are put in these energy shells outside the nucleus. Again, electrons do actually not go in circles around the nucleus, but they do orbit it, just not in a particular pattern. And these shells represent the energy levels of the electrons. So we tend to draw these based on certain rules. The first shell, which is the one closest to the nucleus, fills up once you put 2 electrons in it. So if you have to draw an atom with, let's say, 5 electrons, you would put 2 in the first shell, but then you have to go to the second shell, and you could put your remaining 3. The second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. So 2 in the first, 8 in the second. The third shell can hold up to 18 electrons. Now there's some disagreement about drawing the third shell and then the fourth shell. We're not going to go into that here. We'll just stick to these basic rules for now. Alright, so one of the most important rules in explaining how atoms combine is called the octet rule. You should know the prefix oct or octo means 8, and what this means is atoms want 8 electrons in their outermost shell. That makes them stable and happy. So except for hydrogen and helium and some of the other really, really light elements, a filled outer shell contains 8 electrons. So when an atom has 8 in its outer shell, like I said, we tend to say it's stable, or it's not reactive, or it's happy, meaning it's reached its goal and now it doesn't want to react. It doesn't want to get electrons, it doesn't want to lose any. If it doesn't have 8, that means it does want to react. It wants to get electrons or lose them. Alright, if it does gain or lose electrons with another atom, that's called an ionic bond between atoms. If it shares electrons, that's called a covalent bond. So check out this picture and see if you can figure out what type of bond it is. Formed between the oxygen and the hydrogen to make water. So look over here. Are the electrons given from one to another, or are they shared? This is a covalent bond because they are shared. You can see them drawn like this. Alright, the last thing for today, talking about charged particles, you may hear the term ion. That is just an atom with a positive or negative charge, meaning it's gained or lost an electron. So if an atom loses an electron, like here, lithium loses an electron, right? So now it has 3 protons and only 2 electrons. Now it has a +1 charge. So we could say it's a positive ion, or we could say it's a cation. If it gained an electron, we would say it's an anion, or a negative ion. And what you tend to see is cations wanting to react with anions to form neutral molecules. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss bonding. That's all for today. Feel free to rewatch the video if needed. Thank you.